No man will have you now." Her sister Rosamond laughed, the sound as bright and cruel as shattering glass. The words, meant to be a final, severing blow, echoed in the sudden hush of the crowded ballroom. Eleanora Sterling stood frozen, the fine wool of her borrowed grey gown feeling like a shroud. Every eye in the Mayfair drawing-room was upon her. Her father, Viscount Sterling, whose face was a mask of cold fury at her social failure. Her former fiancé, Lord Ashworth, who looked away with the feigned regret of a man who has just traded a serviceable horse for a prize mare. And her sister, Rosamond, resplendent in ivory silk, her lips curved in triumph. They had carved up her future between them, leaving her with nothing. She was 22, plain, and now publicly discarded. It was a death sentence in the world she knew. A low murmur rippled through the assembled guests, a tide of pity and scorn that threatened to drown her. Eleanora lifted her chin, her spine a rod of iron. She would not weep. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would simply endure this, as she had endured everything else. From the shadowed alcove near the French doors, a figure detached itself from the gloom. He was a man rarely seen in such frivolous gatherings, a man spoken of in whispers in gentlemen's clubs and government chambers. Alistair Vane, the Duke of Blackwood, the Iron Duke, a man whose fortune was as vast as his reputation was formidable. He was tall, dressed in severe, immaculate black, his face a collection of harsh planes and angles that might have been handsome before something had broken it. A faint scar, a silver line from temple to jaw, caught the candlelight. He moved with a predator's economy, the crowd parting before him as if by instinct. He did not look at Rosamond or Lord Ashworth. His eyes, the colour of a winter sky, found Eleanora and held her fast. There was no pity in his gaze, only a cool, unnerving assessment. He walked not to her, but to her father. "Lord Sterling." The Duke's voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. "A word. In private." The Viscount, flustered by the attention of a man so far above his station, paled and nodded, scurrying after the Duke into a small antechamber. The door closed, muffling their voices. The ballroom held its breath. Eleanora remained standing in the centre of the floor, a statue of quiet disgrace. Minutes stretched into an eternity. When the door opened again, it was the Duke who emerged alone. His expression was unchanged, a mask of cold neutrality. He crossed the remaining space and stopped before her. He was so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of iron and winter air that clung to him. He offered no bow, no social pleasantry. He simply looked down at her, his gaze missing nothing. "Miss Sterling," he stated, his voice a quiet command that cut through the room's tension. "Your father has consented. The contracts will be drawn up tonight." Eleanora stared, her mind unable to form a question. Contracts for what? He seemed to understand her confusion, for a flicker of something, impatience perhaps, crossed his face. He offered her his arm, a formal, impersonal gesture. "Your carriage awaits," he said, the words dropping like stones into the silence. "Or perhaps I should say our carriage." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of her family. "Your Grace, if you believe a person's worth is not defined by those who discard them, subscribe for more stories like this. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from, as we uncover the life that brought Eleanora to this moment. Her story was not one of ball gowns and whispered sweet nothings, but of ink-stained fingers and the cold, hard facts of numbers that refused to lie. For 5 years she had been the secret, unacknowledged steward of her father's failing estate. While her brother, Thomas, gambled away his allowance in London, and Rosamond practised her watercolours, Eleanora was the one locked in the dusty estate office, pouring over the ledgers. She was the one who saw the rot creeping in at the edges, the tenants' rents in arrears, the falling price of wool, the ill-advised loans her father had taken against their harvests. She had a mind for systems, for the intricate dance of coin and consequence. She proposed new crop rotations, negotiated with suppliers for fairer prices, and found efficiencies in the household accounts that saved them from ruin more than once. Her father would accept her neatly written reports, grunt in vague approval, and then, in the company of his peers, claim the successes as his own shrewd management. Her contributions were erased, her intelligence a useful but unmentionable tool, like a well-oiled key used to open a stubborn lock and then forgotten in a pocket. Her world was one of quiet, essential work, for which she received no credit and no gratitude. Food was often a reflection of their precarious state. While guests were served roasted duck and fine claret, the family meals were simpler, thinner, a watery soup, a small portion of mutton, bread that was a day past its best. Eleanora ate what was given, her mind on the cost of flour and the yield of the potato fields. Her one loyal ally in that house was a young housemaid named Clara, a girl with kind eyes and hands that were never still. Clara was the only one who saw. She would bring Eleanora a cup of tea late at night as she worked, a silent offering of solidarity. "You've a better head for this than the Viscount himself, miss," Clara had whispered once, her voice full of awe as she watched Eleanora's pen fly across the page, balancing a column of figures that had vexed the estate manager for a week. That small acknowledgment was a greater treasure to Eleanora than any of Rosamond's silken ribbons. Her family treated her competence as an unfortunate eccentricity, a mark of her plainness. "So serious, Eleanora," her mother would sigh, seeing her with a book on agriculture instead of an embroidery hoop. "It's no wonder you frighten the young men away." Rosamond was more direct. "Your nose will be permanently smudged with ink," she would taunt. "It hardly improves the view." They saw her mind not as an asset, but as another flaw, like her too sharp chin or her quiet demeanor. They could not comprehend a value that could not be displayed in a ballroom or captured by a portrait artist. They used the fruits of her labor to maintain the very social standing from which she was excluded, a bitter irony that settled deep in her bones. She was the engine of the house, hidden away in the dark, while they preened and posed on the sunlit decks above. This was the life that had led to the crisis, a life of being utterly essential and entirely invisible, a paradox that was about to be shattered by the most notorious man in England. The engagement to Lord Ashworth had been, like everything in her life, a matter of practicality. He was a baron with a respectable title, but depleted lands that bordered her father's. The union was a merger, a consolidation of assets. Eleanora had understood this. She had not expected love, but she had hoped for a measure of respect, for a partnership where her skills might finally be acknowledged. For a time, it seemed possible. Ashworth would listen, with a kind of bemused admiration, as she spoke of drainage tiles and tenant contracts. "You have a man's mind for business, my dear," he would say, meaning it as a compliment. She accepted it as such, not yet recognizing the condescension that lay beneath. He was handsome, charming, and attentive in all the socially required ways. He brought her flowers from his own hothouse and praised her simple gowns. Eleanora, who had never been the object of such concentrated charm, allowed a small, cautious bud of hope to grow. She began to imagine a future, a home of her own, an estate to manage not in secret, but as its rightful mistress. The hope was a fragile thing, easily crushed. The instrument of its destruction was her own sister. Rosamond, who had always viewed Eleanora's engagement as a personal affront, an older, plainer sister married off first, began to weave her web. She flirted with Ashworth subtly at first, a lowered gaze here, a light touch on the arm there. She would appear in the garden when he visited, her laughter bright and effortless, making Eleanora's serious conversation seem dull and mannish by comparison. The betrayal was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, creeping poison. Eleanora saw the way Ashworth's eyes followed Rosamond across a room. She heard the shift in his compliments, from her mind to her sister's beauty. The final brutal blow came on a Tuesday afternoon. Seeking Ashworth to discuss a letter from a tenant, she was directed by a maid toward the conservatory. The air inside was warm and thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth. And there, behind a screen of ferns, she saw them. Rosamond was in his arms, her head tilted back, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was anything but chaste. Ashworth's hand was tangled in her golden hair. They broke apart, laughing, and it was the sound of that shared, careless laughter that truly broke Eleanora's heart. "He will tell her tonight," Rosamond said, her voice giddy with triumph. "Father has agreed. A better match all around, don't you think?" Ashworth's reply was a low murmur, but his agreement was plain in his posture, in the way he drew Rosamond closer. Eleanora backed away, silent and unseen, the tenant's letter crushed in her hand. That evening, her father summoned her to his study. The room smelled of old leather and disappointment. He did not ask her to sit. He stood before the cold fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, and delivered the verdict. "Lord Ashworth has withdrawn his suit," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of sympathy. "He has made a new proposal for Rosamond's hand. I have accepted. It is a more advantageous arrangement." He spoke of her future, as if she were a line item in a ledger he was striking through. "Your prospects," he continued, "are now significantly diminished. You have become a liability, Eleanora, an embarrassment." There was no comfort offered, no kindness. There was only the cold arithmetic of her new reality. She was a failed commodity, returned to the shelf. It was this public execution, this final dismissal, that led her to the London ball 2 weeks later, a pariah brought forth for one last humiliation before being locked away for good. The carriage ride to Blackwood Manor was conducted in absolute silence. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves and the creak of the leather upholstery were the only sounds that filled the darkness. Eleanora sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing blur of the moonlit countryside. Across from her, the Duke of Blackwood was a study in stillness, a figure carved from shadow and granite. He did not speak, did not fidget, did not even seem to breathe. He simply occupied the space, his presence a palpable weight in the enclosed carriage. She had expected questions, or perhaps a lecture on her new duties, but he offered nothing. This silence was more unnerving than any interrogation. It was a vacuum into which all her fears and uncertainties rushed. After what felt like an eternity, the carriage slowed, turning onto a long gravel drive flanked by ancient skeletal oaks. Blackwood Manor rose before them, a vast and intimidating edifice of dark stone, its crenellated towers stark against the starry sky. It was not a home, it was a fortress, built to withstand a siege. Lights glowed in only a handful of its many mullioned windows, making the place seem more deserted than inhabited. A groom rushed to open the door, and the Duke descended without a word, turning to offer her his hand. His grip was firm and cool, a brief, impersonal contact that sent a strange shiver through her. He led her up the wide stone steps and through a set of massive oak doors into a great hall. The air inside was cold, carrying the scent of stone, beeswax, and something else, the faint, clean smell of disuse. A severe-looking woman in a black bombazine dress, her grey hair pulled into a ruthlessly tight bun, stood waiting. "Mrs. Gable," the Duke said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This is the Duchess. See to her needs." "Mrs." Gable gave Eleonora a single, comprehensive glance, her expression unreadable, and dipped into a curtsy. "Your Grace." A young maid with wide, nervous eyes, who could not have been more than 16, stepped forward. "Anya will show you to your rooms," the Duke stated, already turning away. "We will speak in my study in 1 hour." And with that he was gone, his footsteps receding down a long, dark corridor. The young maid, Anya, bobbed a curtsy. "This way, Your Grace." She led Eleonora up a grand, sweeping staircase of cold marble, its silence broken only by the whisper of their skirts. They passed down a long gallery lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her with silent judgment. The suite of rooms Anya led her to was vast and opulent, furnished with heavy, dark wood furniture and rich, faded tapestries. But it was also cold, impeccably clean, and utterly impersonal. A fire had been laid in the grate but not lit. Precisely 1 hour later, as promised, Anya returned to guide her to the Duke's study. The room was the heart of the fortress, a space lined from floor to ceiling with books. A massive desk of dark mahogany dominated the center, and a low fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the leather-bound spines. The Duke stood by the fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit." Eleonora sat. He remained standing, his back to the fire. "Let us be clear about the terms of our arrangement, so there are no future misunderstandings," he began, his tone as cool and dispassionate as if he were discussing a deed of sale. "You are now the Duchess of Blackwood. You will have my name, my protection, and access to my fortune for the running of this household and your personal needs. You will act as mistress of this estate and any of our other properties. You will preside over my table and serve as my hostess when required. If this union produces an heir, he will inherit everything." He took a slow sip from his glass. "In return, I require your complete loyalty in public. In private, I require only that you manage my domestic affairs with competence and discretion." He finally met her eyes, his gaze direct and piercing. "I do not offer companionship, affection, or the sentimental trappings of marriage. I do not expect them from you. This is a partnership, a contract. Cold indifference is a foundation upon which we can build a peaceful coexistence. Active sentiment is not. Do we have an accord?" Eleonora looked at this cold, unreadable man, and felt not fear, but a strange, sharp sense of relief. He was not offering a lie, he was offering a truth she could live with. Active cruelty had nearly destroyed her. Cold indifference felt like a sanctuary. "We do, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady. In the first weeks, Eleonora moved through Blackwood Manor like a ghost, an observer learning the rhythms of her new cage. The house was a place of profound, oppressive silence. The staff, overseen by the formidable Mrs. Gable, moved with quiet efficiency, their faces trained to a perfect neutrality. They were watchful, their loyalty to the Duke absolute, their judgment of his new, strangely acquired Duchess held in careful reserve. Eleonora understood. She was an anomaly, a disruption to their ordered, solitary world. She did not try to win them over with false smiles or friendly overtures. Instead, she began to work. It was the only way she knew to inhabit a space, to make it her own. She requested the household accounts from a reluctant Mr. Finch, the estate steward, a man who clearly saw her as an interloper. The ledgers, when they finally arrived, were a disaster of mismanagement and neglect. Finch had been paying exorbitant prices to suppliers who were his friends, and the books were a model of creative arithmetic. Eleonora spent a week in the small morning room she had claimed as her office, tracing every expenditure, cross-referencing every invoice. She worked with the methodical precision she had honed over years of thankless labor, the familiar scratch of her pen on paper a comforting sound in the silent house. At the end of the week, she summoned Mr. Finch. She did not accuse him. She simply laid out her revised budgets, her new proposed supplier lists, and the evidence of the savings, a full 30% they would realize. His face went from condescending to ashen. He had no defense against the cold, hard numbers. He sputtered, he blustered, but the facts were undeniable. She presented her findings to the Duke that evening in his study. He reviewed the documents in silence, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he looked up. "Finch is dismissed," he said, without emotion. "The steward's duties are now yours." It was not praise, but it was an acknowledgement of her competence. It was more than she had ever received from her father. She turned her attention to the house itself. She discovered entire wings shuttered and draped in dust cloths, rooms filled with beautiful things that no one ever saw. And she discovered the gardens. What had once been a magnificent landscape of terraces, follies, and rose arbors was now a wilderness. The paths were choked with weeds, the statues green with moss, the rose bushes a tangled, thorny mass. Only a small vegetable patch near the kitchens showed any sign of care. She found the head gardener, a gnarled, ancient man named Mr. Abernathy, who seemed as weathered as the stone walls. He told her the gardens had been his late mother's pride. Since her death, the Duke had shown no interest. "He locked the gates to the rose garden himself, Your Grace," Abernathy said, his voice raspy with disuse. "Said he couldn't abide the sight of it." Eleanora saw not neglect, but potential. She began to spend her afternoons there, working alongside Abernathy, her hands, unused to such labor, quickly becoming calloused and sore. She learned to prune the roses, to clear the overgrown paths, to feel the satisfaction of bringing order out of chaos. The Duke, she knew, was watching. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of him at a window, a dark figure observing her from a distance. He never approached, never spoke of her work, but his observation was a constant, silent presence. The staff began to change. Mrs. Gable's severity softened into a grudging respect. Anya, the young maid, began to speak to her, sharing small details of her life, her family. She would leave a vase with a single, perfect rose from the reclaimed garden on Eleanora's desk. These small acts of kindness were cracks of light in the austere facade of the house. The manor was slowly, quietly, beginning to feel less like a fortress and more like a home. One evening, unable to sleep, she went down to the library, the one room in the house that felt truly warm and alive. She found the Duke there, seated in a worn leather armchair by the fire, a book open in his lap. He looked up as she entered, but did not seem surprised. He simply nodded toward the other chair. She took it, selecting a book of her own. They sat in a shared, companionable silence for over an hour, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the turning of pages. As she finally rose to leave, he spoke, his voice quiet. "Good night, Eleanora." It was the first time he had used her given name. The library became their unspoken meeting place. Several nights a week, drawn by insomnia or a shared need for quiet refuge, they would find themselves there. The silence between them began to change, evolving from a formal absence of conversation into something more comfortable, a shared space where words were not required. He would look up from his book and find her watching the fire, her expression thoughtful, and a strange, unreadable emotion would flicker in his eyes before he returned to his reading. It was in the library, during a rain-swept afternoon, that she made the discovery. She was searching for a volume on botanical prints on a high shelf, her fingers tracing the dusty leather spines. As she pulled one book free, her hand brushed against the wooden paneling behind it. It felt loose. Curiosity piqued, she pressed gently, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside sat a heavy, iron-bound box, its surface coated in a thick layer of dust. It was not locked. With a sense of trepidation, she lifted the heavy lid. The box contained 2 distinct sets of documents. On top was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded black ribbon. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, and the ink was faded with age. The first letter began, "My dearest Alistair," but the tone quickly soured. They were letters from his first wife, Isabella. Eleanora knew the rumours that the Duke's first marriage had ended in tragedy and scandal, that his wife had been unfaithful. But the letters revealed a betrayal far deeper than mere infidelity. Isabella had been conspiring with his most bitter political rivals, feeding them information about his financial dealings, his strategies, his vulnerabilities. She had systematically worked to ruin him, all while penning declarations of her undying love. It was a portrait of breathtaking cruelty and deceit. It explained the walls he had built around himself, the fortress of Blackwood, the coldness that was not an absence of feeling, but a shield against it. Beneath the letters lay a second, more shocking discovery, a series of ledgers bound in dark green leather. They were not household accounts. They were meticulously detailed records of debt acquisitions. Over the past 5 years, Alistair Vane had been systematically and quietly buying the outstanding debts of dozens of aristocratic families. He owned them, in essence, holding their financial futures in his hands. As she turned the pages, her heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She saw names she recognized, barons, earls, men who sat in the House of Lords. And then she saw 2 names that made the blood drain from her face. Viscount Stirling, her father. The Duke had purchased his entire debt portfolio a year ago. And on the next page, Lord Ashworth. His debts were even more substantial, a mountain of gambling losses and ill-advised investments. The Duke of Blackwood owned them both, utterly and completely. The cold air of the library seemed to thicken, to suffocate her. The carefully constructed peace of her new life shattered. The contract, the carriage, the proposal to her father, it was all a lie. He hadn't rescued her. He had purchased her. She was simply another asset, another acquisition in his cold, calculated war against the world. The competence he valued, the respect she thought she had earned, was it all just an appreciation for a well-chosen tool? The trust that had been slowly, tentatively growing between them curdled into a bitter poison. She felt a familiar, sickening lurch of betrayal, sharper this time, because she had allowed herself to hope. She closed the box, her movement stiff and mechanical, and placed it on the large library table. She would not hide. She would not cower. She would confront him with his lies. She waited there, in the deepening gloom of the afternoon, for the master of the house to return. He found her there 2 hours later as dusk was settling, the box sitting between them on the polished mahogany like a judge. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze moving from her pale, set face to the box. And he knew. A shutter came down over his expression, the familiar mask of cold indifference snapping back into place. "You have been busy," he said, his voice flat. He walked to the fireplace, not looking at her, and stirred the embers with a poker. The clatter of iron against iron was the only sound. "Did you buy me, Your Grace?" Eleanora's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's tension like a blade. Was I simply part of the price for my father's debts? A convenient clause in a financial transaction? He turned from the fire, his face half in shadow, the scar along his jaw a stark white line. "The debts gave me leverage over your father, yes," he admitted, without a trace of apology. It ensured he would agree to my terms without argument. So you admit it? She whispered, the words tasting of ash. I am a possession. No, he said, and for the first time a flicker of emotion, anger, frustration broke through his control. You are not? I could have ruined your father a year ago. I could have called in his notes and cast him into the street. I did not. I chose you, Eleonora, not because I owned him, but because of what I saw at that ball. He took a step closer. I saw a woman who had been publicly betrayed and humiliated by everyone she should have been able to trust, and I saw her stand tall, without tears, and face them down. I saw steel where everyone else saw broken china. I needed a duchess. I chose one with a spine. His honesty was as brutal and unadorned as his reputation. It disarmed her, confused her. Before she could process his words, before she could decide whether to believe this stark, strange explanation, they were interrupted. The library door opened, and the butler, a man named Poole, stood there, his expression troubled. Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion. There is a gentleman at the door, a Lord Ashworth. He insists on seeing the Duchess. He claims it is a matter of great urgency. The name hung in the air between them, a phantom from a life she had thought left behind. Alistair's entire demeanour shifted. The coldness returned, but it was different now, not a defensive wall, but a weapon being unsheathed. His eyes, fixed on Eleonora's, were dark and hard as flint. You see, he said, his voice a low growl. The world does not simply let you go. It claws at you. He turned to the butler. Lord Ashworth is not welcome in this house. He will be told the Duchess is not available, now or ever. See him out, Poole. Use whatever means are necessary. The butler bowed and retreated, closing the door softly. The Duke turned back to Eleonora. The threat from the outside world had, in a strange way, validated his words. He had positioned himself not as her owner, but as her shield. The raw anger and betrayal in her heart began to recede, replaced by a bewildering confusion. He had not lied about the debts, but perhaps he had not lied about his reasons either. The letters, she said, her voice barely a whisper, gesturing to the box. Your first wife. A shadow passed over his face, so profound it was as if the fire in the hearth had died. Isabella taught me the price of trust, he said, his voice rough. She taught me that sentiment is a vulnerability to be exploited. I swore I would never be that vulnerable again. He looked at her then, and the wall of his composure seemed to crack, revealing the raw, damaged man beneath. I brought you here on cold terms because it was the only honest offer I knew how to make. That night, the house was quieter than ever, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a reminder of the chasm that had opened between them. Eleonora did not go to the library. She sat in her cold, opulent room, the Duke's words echoing in her mind. I chose one with a spine. It was the most profound compliment she had ever received, and it had come from the most unlikely of men. She replayed the scene in the library, his stark honesty, his immediate, absolute defense of her against Ashworth. He had not consulted her. He had simply protected his own. Or had he protected her? The distinction felt vital. Around midnight, a soft knock came at her door. It was Anya, carrying a tray. His Grace thought you might be hungry, ma'am, she said, her young face full of concern. On the tray was a bowl of rich, hot soup, a piece of fresh bread, and a glass of wine. It was a simple gesture, but it was an act of care, an intrusion of warmth into the cold terms of their contract. An hour later, still restless, she found herself drawn back to the library. The fire was banked low, and the room was lit by a single lamp on the desk. He was there, not reading, but staring into the dying flames, the empty glass from earlier still on the table beside him. He looked up as she entered, his face haggard in the dim light. "I could not sleep," she said, offering the simple truth. "Nor I," he replied. She walked to the hearth and stood near him, sharing the fading warmth. The silence stretched, but it was different now, heavy with unspoken things. "What Isabella did," he said at last, his voice low and raspy. "It was not just betrayal. She took my name, my fortune, my political alliances, and she turned them into weapons against me. She nearly destroyed me. Not for love of another man, but for the sheer pleasure of the game." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a bleakness that stole her breath. "I rebuilt my life on one principle: trust no one. Control everything. Blackwood became my fortress. The debts became my walls. I made myself untouchable." He paused, his gaze dropping to her hands, which she had clasped tightly in front of her. "And then I saw you, and you were not playing a game. You were surviving. You were real. In a room full of liars and performers, you were the only real thing." He fell silent, as if the admission had cost him dearly. Eleanora felt the last of her anger dissolve, replaced by a profound, aching empathy. She understood him, this powerful, damaged man who had armor-plated his heart. He had been betrayed by sentiment, so he had made a world for himself devoid of it. "And me?" she asked softly. "Am I real enough to be trusted?" He looked at her for a long moment, a battle raging in his eyes. The Iron Duke, the man who controlled everything, was losing control of the careful fortress he had built. "I built these walls to keep the world out," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "I did not account for you. I did not expect you to come inside and begin to tend the garden." He reached out then, his movement slow, hesitant, as if he were touching fire. His fingers, calloused and warm, brushed against her cheek. It was not a gesture of ownership or passion, but of discovery, a simple, devastating acknowledgement. "You have become essential to me, Eleanora," he confessed, the words stark and plain. "And it terrifies me." The wall had not just cracked, it had crumbled, and in its ruins something new and fragile was beginning to grow. The Duke and Duchess of Blackwood's autumn ball was the most anticipated event of the London season. Invitations were coveted, not merely for the spectacle, but for the opportunity to see the infamous Iron Duke and his mysterious, plain-faced Duchess in their own domain. For Eleanora, it was a trial by fire. It was a declaration that she was not the discarded woman from that Mayfair ballroom, but the mistress of one of the most powerful houses in England. Alistair had spared no expense. The great hall, once cold and cavernous, was transformed. Thousands of candles glittered in the chandeliers, casting a warm, golden light on garlands of autumn leaves and late-blooming roses from her own restored gardens. A string orchestra played from the minstrels' gallery, their music weaving through the murmur of the assembled aristocracy. Eleanora stood beside her husband at the top of the grand staircase, greeting their guests. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, a colour Alistair had chosen himself. It was simple, elegant, and it made her eyes shine like stars. She felt not like an impostor, but like she belonged. She saw her family arrive, her father looking nervous and diminished, her sister Rosamond, her beauty seeming brittle and sharp in the warm light, her arm linked possessively through Lord Ashworth's. They looked at Eleanora with a mixture of disbelief and envy. Ashworth's smile was a tight, predatory thing. He clearly saw the evening not as a celebration, but as an opportunity. Throughout the evening, Eleanora moved through the rooms with a quiet confidence that surprised everyone, including herself. She discussed estate management with a group of landowners, impressing them with her knowledge. She spoke French with a visiting ambassador. She was poised, intelligent, and utterly in command of her home. Alistair was a constant, steady presence by her side. He said little, but his eyes followed her everywhere, a quiet pride in his gaze that was more eloquent than any flowery speech. The confrontation came, as she knew it would, near midnight. Ashworth, his face flushed with champagne, cornered her near the terrace doors. "Eleonora," he slurred, his voice oozing a false intimacy. "You are radiant, but this is a gilded cage. You cannot truly be happy with that cold brute." "I am perfectly happy, my lord," she replied, her voice level. "And this is my home." "He bought you!" Ashworth hissed, his charm dissolving into raw, desperate ugliness. "Your father sold you to settle his debts. Everyone knows it. You belong with me. You were promised to me." "You surrendered that promise, Lord Ashworth," a low voice said from behind them. Alistair stepped to Eleonora's side, placing a hand on the small of her back. He did not look at Ashworth with anger, but with a kind of bored contempt. "My wife's affairs are my own." Ashworth, emboldened by drink and desperation, raised his voice, drawing the attention of those nearby. "You coerced her. You used her family's ruin to trap her. She is your prisoner, not your wife." The music faltered. A circle of silence widened around them. This was it, the public test. Alistair did not raise his voice. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A man stepped forward from the crowd, the Duke's solicitor, Mr. Davies, looking grimly professional. In his hand he held a sheaf of papers. "Lord Ashworth," Alistair said, his voice carrying with perfect clarity in the sudden hush. "You speak of ruin. Let us discuss your own." Davies handed the papers to a stunned Ashworth. They were his debt ledgers, every gambling note, every defaulted loan, all of it held by the Duke of Blackwood. "As of this morning," Alistair continued calmly, "I have called in every one of your debts. You are bankrupt, my lord. The house your father left you, the lands you were so keen to merge with the Sterlings, they are mine." Ashworth stared at the papers, his face turning a mottled, ugly red. Her father and sister standing nearby looked horrified. Alistair then turned his attention to the assembled guests. His gaze swept the room, commanding absolute silence. "My wife," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that was absolute, "is the most intelligent, capable, and honourable woman I have ever had the privilege of knowing. She is the mistress of this house, not by my decree, but by her own merit and tireless work. She is my partner, my counsel, and my duchess. Any person who dares to question her honour or her place here questions me." He looked down at Eleonora, and for a moment they were the only two people in the room. He was not rescuing her. He was validating her, naming her worth for the world to hear. He offered her his arm. "Shall we, Your Grace?" She placed her hand on his, and together they walked away, leaving the ruins of her past behind them for good. Months later, spring had come to Blackwood. The air was soft, filled with the scent of damp earth and the promise of new life. The gardens, once a tangled wreck, were now a masterpiece of order and beauty. Daffodils and tulips bloomed in bright swathes along the cleared paths, and the rose bushes, pruned and tended with Eleonora's own hands, were covered in tight green buds. It was here, in the heart of the restored rose garden, that she and Alistair now stood. The morning was quiet, the great house behind them still sleeping. They were not speaking of contracts or debts, of enemies vanquished or society's opinion. They were simply existing in the peaceful world they had built together, a world born from a cold transaction and nurtured into something warm and real. Alistair reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, It was a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. He looked around at the garden, at the evidence of her patient, steady work. "You have brought this place back to life," he said, his voice quiet. "This place," she replied, her gaze soft as she looked at him. "And its master." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his harsh features, erasing the last shadows of the Iron Duke and revealing only the man, Alistair. He had learned to speak of his feelings in the same way he spoke of facts, plainly, directly, and with absolute certainty. He turned to face her, his hands holding both of hers now. The scar on his face was just a part of him, a map of a past they both understood. "The terms of our contract have been significantly amended," he said, a glint of humor in his winter sky eyes. "By both parties?" "They have," she agreed. "I never promised you affection," he stated, as if reciting a well-remembered clause. "And I never promised you love." He paused, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I was wrong. I love you, Eleonora. It is the most undeniable fact of my existence." The words were not a dramatic, flowery declaration. They were a statement of truth, delivered with the full weight of his conviction, more powerful for their simplicity. She felt a profound and lasting peace settle over her, the final healing of a wound she had carried for so long. Here, in this garden they had restored together, she was not plain or discarded, or a liability. She was essential, she was home, and she was loved. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting over his heart, feeling its steady, strong beat. "And I love you, Alistair," she whispered, the words as true and as real as the solid ground beneath their feet. "Thank you for joining us on Eleonora's journey from rejection to restoration. We hope her story resonated with you. Would you have trusted a man like the Duke, whose reasons were hidden behind such high walls? Let us know your thoughts and where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. The best alliances, after all, often begin as the most honest transactions.